we've done significant progress over the last 8 years in a tough economy. Now, what the Fredette budget would do is drive that income tax rate down to a 0%. We can get there. There's a question of reprioritization. We've done that over the last 8 years. That's why we've been able to lower the structural gap from $1.2 billion down to about $150 million. Again, that's a big deal.
Hi again, I'm Matt Gagne, the CEO of the Maine Heritage Policy Center, and we're here for yet another candidate interview. We're talking policy with all the gubernatorial candidates of both parties, and we'll also be interviewing some of the independents that are running as well throughout the series of the next few weeks. And joining us here today is Ken Fredette, candidate for governor and minority leader in the House of Representatives. A pleasure to have you here, sir.
Nice to see you again, and still working. We still have some unfinished work up in the legislature, and I suspect we'll be doing that soon.
Yeah, so let's actually start there. Clearly, you're going to be going back a little bit later in the year here, whether it's in July or September. I hear lots of rumors, but you have a few things on the docket, one of which is tax conformity. And, you know, it's interesting to me because it's one of the most important topics that nobody, I think, out there outside of the inside baseball crowd in Augusta really understands at all.
Yep.
Like what tax conformity even is, why it's important. It should be hopefully a softball for you, but just explain to us a little bit exactly what that is about and why it's such an important thing for, I think, the state to be doing.
And I actually think the schedule is going to be June, Matt, in terms of going back into session. We may even start some of the committee work before June arrives. And so I anticipate really by June 30 we'll have this mostly wrapped up. So, you know, tax conformity is something that is simply part of President Trump's agenda in regards to lowering taxes on Maine people and corporations. And what that means is at the federal level they did some tax reform, the most significant since 1986 when President Reagan did their income tax reform. And what that means is at the state of Maine level is that we do everything essentially based off what is called the adjusted gross income on your federal tax return. Most people won't know what that means, but the bottom line is we basically do everything the federal government does so that we don't have to spend a lot of money on audits and stuff like that in terms of personnel at the Maine Revenue Services. Tax-wise, what it means for Maine corporations and taxpayers is if we don't do anything to conform to the federal government's reductions in taxes, Maine taxpayers are probably going to end up paying about $230 million more in taxes.
Do you think that there's a realistic possibility that that gets done?
There is, and I'm going to say that there's probably a 95% chance that we're going to get tax conformity done when we go back in session, probably in June.
Well, from your perspective, that'll be likely your last real act as a legislator, and you know, if you were to get what you want, become the next governor, and then it'll be up to you to set the policy on taxes and everything else. But let's start with taxes. I know in this campaign there's been an awful lot of talk of taxes, particularly in the Republican side of things, and what exactly to do with it. There's a variety of opinions. I guess let's start with a very simple question. What is Ken Fredette's goal for the state income tax in the next 4 years of the Fredette administration? Where do you win?
Well, let's put that in context, Matt. So for the month of April that just went by, the month of April, tax revenues for the month, budget over actual. So the state of Maine says we are going to budget X amount of dollars that we think is going to come in revenue, and then there's the actual. $55 million more came in revenue for the month of April than was budgeted. Now that's significant because we've already did an upward revisement on those revenue projections once already this first year of the biennium. What that means is that our economy is on fire. It's going on all 8 cylinders, 2.5%, which is essentially full employment. That's raising wages throughout the state, and it's attracting people, I think, to the state, and it's a big deal. So what we've seen is in fact, in this most recent data for the month of April is even though we've reduced the income tax rate, we're actually generating more revenue because people are working more and they're getting paid more. And so therefore the state is taking in more in revenue. Now, my answer to that would be is that we therefore means that we're taking too much of the taxpayers' money. And so what does that mean? That we need to continue to drive the income tax rate down. I think we can get to zero. I think it's going to take a period of time over which to get there, but I think we've started the process. I think we've shown that we can do it. 2010, when we did the first income tax cut, $400 million, largest in Maine history. Democrats said we were going to go right off the cliff. Here we are 8 years later with just a growing Maine economy.
Now, that said, I mean, we've only gone down to 7.15. Obviously, we're still not competitive. We're better than we were, but we're still not competitive compared to our neighbors, compared to the country as a whole. 0% has always been the goal of the Maine Heritage Policy Center, obviously. But how do you get there? I mean, is this something where you're trying to incrementally go down by 0.30, 0.50 every once in a while, as much as you can do over time? Is there something that you can come up with for legislation that would automatically do that over time? Or is it something where you dream big a little bit and you try to come up with a wholesale revision of the tax code that perhaps reimagines taxes in a lot of different ways, that gets it down to a 3 or a 2 or even a 0, and deals with that from that perspective?
Right. Well, I'm going to correct you just a little bit, Matt, because what I'm going to say is that for about 50 to 60,000 people in Maine that no longer have to file taxes, we have created a zero income tax bracket. People that in 2010 that were paying taxes, 50 to 60,000 of those people now no longer even have to file taxes because we've taken them off the tax rolls. That's a big deal. That's roughly 10% of our workforce. So I think that's fairly significant. The other thing that I would say is significant is when we came in the legislature in 2010, the top income tax rate in the state of Maine at that point in time, 8.5%, kicked in at $20,000. So $20,000, you were considered a high income earner. You paid the top income tax rate at 8.5%. That is no longer the law. I sat down with a table just like you and I are right now, face to face with the Speaker, Mark Eves, Democrat Speaker of the House. We negotiated an income tax reduction package. We increased that rate from $20,000 to kick in at the top income tax rate, all the way up to $50,000. Now that's a big deal when you consider that the per capita average income in Maine is about $43,000. So what that meant is that we kicked a lot of people into that lower income tax bracket by making that move. So we've made progress. The top rate still hasn't come down to where it needs to be, but particularly for I think some of those low income and middle income Mainers, we've made significant progress.
That's all true, but we've also at the same time we've seen a continued flight of wealth to, I mean, I hate to be cliched about this, but to the Floridas and the New Hampshires of the world. I can give names, of course. I think you can give names as well, and that's a significant problem because those people once moved do not give any money to the state treasury at all. They also don't give money to charity. Their kids go with them. Oftentimes the grandkids go with them and spend more time in these other places rather than Maine, and that becomes a significant problem for capital investment in the economy in general. And I know that we're performing well now, but the loss of these people is going to be felt at some point. So I do think that the income tax, wherever it does kick in, I mean, when you're looking at Massachusetts having a 5.1% flat rate, and it's colloquial named Taxachusetts,
right,
and we're well above that. I think that does bear some looking at in terms of where we get to a much lower rate, if not totally eliminated it. And it's just been something we've talked about for so long and made such significant progress at, but still has so much work left to do, I guess, is what
Well, I mean, I think that you're right. And so I think the first part of what I wanted to do was to put this in a proper context for the work that we've actually done over the last 8 years. In fact, starting in the Great Recession, not starting at a point where we had a robust economy and we were simply trying to drive down rates. We've done significant progress over the last 8 years in a tough economy. Now, what the Fredette budget would do is drive that income tax rate down to a 0%. We can get there. There's a question of reprioritization. We've done that over the last 8 years. That's why we've been able to lower the structural gap from $1.2 billion down to about $150 million. Again, that's a big deal. So when you look at those sort of structural reforms that we've done, we've positioned Maine now to look at in those outgoing years. We can begin to lower the rate. When you asked the question, and I said we got $55 million more this month in revenues, the question then becomes, what do you do with that money? And if I'm a Democrat, right, I'm saying Medicaid expansion. If you're Ken Fredette, what I'm saying is income tax cuts. We need to lower the amount of money we're taking from Maine people. We don't need that money. So let's continue to drive that rate down. We will do it, and we will get there, and we will get to 0% under a Fredette administration.
The question of taxes also, of course, really relates to the question of spending.
Yeah.
And, we certainly have seen a lot of fiscal discipline in the LePage administration over the years. And you in the legislature and the House Republicans and even the Senate Republicans to some degree have all, I think, engaged in some very responsible behavior trying to get a lot of that stuff buttoned up. Yet, at the same time, budgets continue to go up. And even under the LePage administration, they've gone up significantly more than, someone like me certainly wants to see them go up. When you compare that to, again, the cliche, but New Hampshire, who has no income tax and no sales tax, the main reason they're able to get away with that is they spend about $1 billion less on welfare than we do. I mean, they have a smaller state budget in regards to what they pay for and how they pay for it. How do we finally actually start to reverse the tide on this spending growth that you see in government, particularly when we're living in an environment, as you know more than probably most people, of divided government, where you have oftentimes a maybe Democratic House and a Republican Senate or vice versa? How does that get accomplished in a Fredette administration?
Well, look, I think what we've shown in Augusta as me as the House Republican leader and working with my colleagues in the House is that we've changed the model. And what I mean by that is if we're going to just continue to go along, to get along, if we're going to kind of be let's sit down and let's kind of figure out what we can trade each other, you get this and I get that, we're going to go right back to the old spending habits of the last 50 years and the taxation habits of the last 50 years, where I'm going to say, quite frankly, that Republicans didn't win. We got 5% of something, we called it a victory and went home.
Right.
We shut down state government last year, and it was only for 3 days, but it was to make changes in the budget that we didn't support, that the governor didn't support. There was more spending in it than we wanted to see, but we did that in order to send a message and to make some issues correct in that budget. Right now, we're in a posture where we're not in the legislature because Democrats now want to combine Medicaid expansion with a spending package and tax conformity. House Republicans said we're not going to play that game, so we're not going to agree to come back in the legislature and finish some of the work that we need to do until you agree that you're not going to be commingling bills so that you can get what you want and we get a little piece of what we want. Mm-hmm. And so it's about changing the game, and what we've done is done that, working together as Republicans, House Republicans and the governor. You have to have both branches. It can't be just the governor. And I'm going to say, quite frankly, that a lot of what the governor has done over the last 8 years would not have happened had it not been for Ken Fredette as a minority leader and the House Republicans in the legislature. No disrespect to anybody else, but that's, I think, a proven fact, and I think that we're going to continue to have that sort of a relationship going forward under a Fredette administration where we all work together so that we can understand that these are important policies. We need to prioritize and put Maine on a track where we are already headed.
The idea of budgeting, of course, is really built on previous budgets. Obviously at the beginning of the LePage administration, we heard a little bit about zero-based budgeting, which, having studied some politicians in other states too, you hear that a lot, and a lot of times when a conservative administration comes into office, and it doesn't end up really happening.
Right.
You have the previous budget builds the next one, and so when it grows, the next one grows. Is there any real hope for actually approaching governance and spending from that sort of zero-based universe where you're actually kind of starting over every year and trying to justify whether or not programs deserve to continue to live on?
Well, but isn't that the Democratic model?
It is.
The Democratic model is, we're going to continue to grow the programs that exist, and so you got a program and it costs $50 million this year, so we want $60 million for it for next year. That's the Democratic model, and by and large, it's been the Republican model that we've operated under previous to 2010. And so I think the answer is yes. And again, I think what it's about is if you have $1 to spend, you can't say, well, now we need $1.10 to spend. You need to say, let's look at how that dollar is being spent and let's set priorities. And I think that's what the issue has been. I think that's what we've done in terms of our members on the Appropriations Committee, down working with both sides of the aisle, saying this is where we think we can go with this budget. So again, I think unless you have people up and down the line, and what I mean by that is House and Senate Republicans working together, working with the Appropriations Committee, working with the Republican governor, a lot of this stuff isn't going to change unless we have all those things working together. Now look, I have some opponents in this race who have no experience at understanding how this process works. And I'm going to suggest that there could be a high degree of frustration there, and I think a very large threat that we're going to be making some backward progress because some people I don't think are going to be willing to go to the mat to fight for those Republican principles, which I think we all believe in.
But when you have it, I mean, you stated it right there. When you have a progressive vision from left-leaning lawmakers that view sort of every program as something that should exist in perpetuity forever and oftentimes grow, and the opposite point of view is that we need to justify it every time that it comes up. It seems like the leftist progressive side of that always wins because you're compromising with their notion, which is that it exists and it grows. And maybe the compromise is that it exists and it just grows a little less. Is that something that, I mean, can a conservative ever really win that argument in government?
Well, I'm going to disagree with you. And the reason why I'm going to disagree with you is because when we came in 2011, Republicans haven't been elected. I, as a freshman legislator, was picked to serve on the Appropriations Committee. A number of things, for example, that we did in making very tough decisions, many times in a bipartisan fashion, for example, was statutorily reducing the process and the number of people on Medicaid. When we came into the legislature in 2011, we had 350,000 people on Medicaid. Now, today we have about 280,000. A lot of that was done in the work in 2011, 2012, when we started to tighten up some of the restrictions on people being able to qualify for Medicaid under the law. And so while the commissioner had some role to play in that in terms of being a bureaucrat running a department, the legislature drove that, okay? And then when you went into the next cycle in 2013 and 14, we then had Democrats, again, having reduced significantly the number of people on Medicaid, starting to slow down that huge cost associated with Medicaid expansion, having to pay $750 million to hospitals that we owed, that we lived up to that responsibility. In the next legislature, in the 126, when I came in as the House Republican leader, 5 times we stopped Democrat attempts to expand Medicaid. Now, what that meant was working with the governor's office so that he would veto a bill. And even though we had only 58 members and only could lose a handful, and that bill would have become law, we were able to stop it. And so what I would answer to you, Matt, is that we in fact not only proved that we could downsize a program, but then we could also maintain it over the next 6 years by being able to stop Medicaid expansion at the legislative level.
And yet, that since we've talked about Medicaid expansion already a few times, I mean, obviously, the Maine People's Alliance engaged in a campaign, along with others, that put it on the ballot. And we had a referendum question that attempted to expand Medicaid. And, of course, you are living through, in the legislature right now, the debates on what to do about that expansion, and now that it's been voted on, what to do. I've heard Republicans say a variety of things about it. Governor LePage, the other day, he was at an event of ours and said something to the effect of, it's the law of the land. It's been voted on by the people, and it needs to be implemented, but it needs to be implemented the right way. And then you hear other people who are running for governor say that, nope, we just shouldn't expand it at all, and I don't really care what the vote was. It's something that is a bad idea, and we shouldn't go forward with it. What is your take on Medicaid expansion and the current limbo we're living in with it, and what should be done about it?
Well, I mean, let's sort of be realist, first of all, Matt. I mean, it's a nice political line that consultants give candidates to say, let's repeal the Medicaid expansion. I mean, it's a great line because, people will go rah, rah, and, let's do that. But the only way you do that is to actually have a majority of Republicans in the House and the Senate and a Republican governor. So let's be realistic right up front and say, there's no way that it's going to get repealed in the legislature, in my opinion. So given that as a fact, and some other political people are going to say, oh yeah, we can repeal it. No, they can't. So given that reality, what I want to say is this. Again, as the House Republican leader, who I think, again, quite frankly, the reason why I'm the most qualified candidate in this campaign is because we've been there and done that and shown that we can do it is, let's look, for example, Matt, at the marijuana law that was passed in a referendum. Now, that was a law that passed as a referendum issue. It was not a very good bill. It was a 1 or 2 sentences on a referendum question, and people voted it in by a very narrow margin. That was not a very good law. Now, there were a couple of attempts to pass a law to make that in terms of a statute and something that would go forward. 2 attempts to do that. Governor vetoed those bills, and only the House Republicans sustained those vetoes and made those bills go away. which then left us with the question of what are we going to do? Now, as you know, Matt, the committee's been working on this now for about a year and a half, and just recently, over the governor's veto, a bill was passed that amended significantly the laws about marijuana in Maine. I didn't vote for that, just as a matter of record, that I do not support recreational marijuana in Maine. However, it did pass, and so that bill did become law. We now have to look at rulemaking. My point in saying that is because the governor was willing to veto a bill, because under my leadership in the House, we were able to sustain 2 vetoes, 2 weak attempts to change that law. We now have a much stronger, a much tougher law on the books in regards to recreational medical marijuana. Same thing has to happen with Medicaid. And what that means is, in terms of Medicaid expansion, we need to have a committee sit down and look at this. What is the way to do it responsibly? It needs to be paid for under a dedicated revenue source, and it needs to be able to not put us in a position where we're going to have to be coming back and asking other departments to give up money for Medicaid expansion. That can get done under leadership, my leadership as governor, and working cooperatively Republicans in the House and the Senate. We've proven that it can get done in the House because of the way we've done that, and I think we can do it again next year after the election.
When we're talking about the issue of health care, obviously I think there's no one in Maine that hasn't been affected by the opioid crisis in some fashion, whether it's a cousin or a friend or brother or just somebody they know. And it is frequently listed by people as one of the things that's on their mind the most. Can't help but be on your mind so much when you see that many people dying every year.
Yep.
I know I've asked this question of you before, but I'd love to get it on the record one more time. The number of times I've heard the legislature say we need to deal with this, we need to come up with a solution to the opioid crisis, act in some way, congratulate themselves on having acted in some fashion, and then a couple months later I read the latest statistics and the number keeps going up. It's staggering. It's like happens every session.
Absolutely.
Can government do anything about this crisis? And I guess if it can, what exactly is that action, and how does the governor of the state, if it's Ken Fredette, actually make that happen?
Well, again, Matt, I think that's again why I think I'm the most qualified candidate to be governor. And I think one of the aspects of that is because of my 20 years in the Maine Air National Guard. I'm a 20-year veteran of the military. I continue to serve as a lieutenant colonel. And look, I think the reality is, and the reason why I think that's important is because I am the only candidate that has said that we need to bring the National Guard into the fight on the war on drugs. And I've never said that that means bringing guns and bullets to the fight. But other states have done this, and that is bringing some of the skills and the qualities that people and equipment that the National Guard has that are available to this. For example, surveillance equipment. Either it might be drones, for example, it might be helicopters, people that have specific skills in terms of detective work or whatnot. Those sorts of things the National Guard can do. And that's why I think one of the reasons as governor, you in fact have a responsibility to do that. Another thing that I've said that I would do is hire more law enforcement, more state police officers, more MDEA officers to combat the war on drugs. And that is in fact what I would have, is a war on drugs. Literally to the point of almost putting up a wall in Kittery and saying, look, if you're going to come into Maine, we're going to check your car and make sure you don't have any drugs. Now, we're not going to go that far, Matt, but I think unless you send a message that if your gangs are going to bring drugs into Maine, and that you are going to pay a real price to that you are going to go to jail, and you're going to go to jail for a long time, then you need to understand that. There are gangs, far more gangs now in Maine than there have ever been bringing drugs into Maine. And it's not just in the urban areas, Lewiston, Auburn, Portland, and Bangor. We're talking Washington County. Washington County has the highest per capita drug overdose rate in the state. When I was up there recently, Matt, 25 to 30% of the babies that were being born in Washington County, in Machias, were being born to drug-addicted women. I mean, we have a crisis on our hands, and we need to deal with prevention. We need to deal with treatment. I think we've failed at this, and I think there's been a failure in leadership at the legislative level and, quite frankly, at the governor's level to really go after this in a big way. I would, in fact, have a war on drugs, and we would go after enforcement in a big, big way. We need to recognize that it's not only killing people, It's destroying people's lives, short of killing people, in terms of destroying families, destroying businesses. And if we don't recognize that and go after it in a real way, in terms of a war on drugs, then I think we fail as a state.
At the same time, though, Ken, you have a situation where so much of the stuff is controlled by things that are outside the state. I mean, the drugs that are coming in to Maine are oftentimes coming from New York and Connecticut and Rhode Island and some of these other places. And we've seen over previous wars on drugs that the fear of arrest or capital punishment or what have you has not stopped the Pablo Escobars from assembling these billion-dollar empires to traffic drugs, because frankly they're not the ones that become really in jeopardy. It's the moles, the people that are bringing it across the border and what have you, and they're the ones that get arrested, the small-time guys. Is this a problem that Maine by itself can even remotely come close to tackling, or are we sort of, I guess by the very nature of it, subject to what the other states are willing to do to get the opioid crisis under control, where it really frankly starts from?
Well, I think first of all, Matt, I think we have to recognize that some of these folks that are addicted to drugs started by taking pain pills. And so we started the process when I was on the Appropriations Committee of having what we called the PMP program, Prescription Management Program, so that people couldn't go out and go doctor shopping to get basically their opioids on regards to their pain. We have in fact slowed down the amount of pain pills that are being prescribed to people who then become addicted to opioids and will go to the black market to do that. But I think it's important to send the message, and I think it's just as important of sending a message on welfare reform, that we are no longer going to stand welfare cheats, welfare fraud, selling welfare cards, EBT cards to drug dealers to get drugs. If you're not out there pounding the pavement, delivering the message that say, if you're coming to Maine, your gangs come to Maine, and you're going to be dealt with accordingly, then again, shame on us. We have to, in fact, have this as a very top priority, be a top priority in my budget, again, in terms of reprioritizing spending within the budget and recognizing that I, for example, don't believe we have enough MDEA agents. I think that's a very simple fix. These kinds of cases take a long time to investigate and then to prosecute, then to arrest. And at the same time, I don't think we have enough state police officers that are dealing with domestic violence cases already. Maybe it's murder investigations and some of these other cases that are, distracted from being able to deal with these sorts of cases. And so I think you have to have a multi-level prong attack. We can't control what the other states are going to do. I would reach out to other states in terms of creating a compact, working with them in terms of sharing information and resources so that we can do this in a regional way to the extent that they want to. But until we make it a top priority and show it to be a top priority in terms of spending, in terms of the budget, it's not going to be effective.
As I consider our conversation here about healthcare and opioid crisis and Medicaid, which you brought up before, it strikes me that the conservative movement, broadly speaking, has a pretty big problem with the issue of healthcare, and we continually lose these fights, and especially on Medicaid, because it feels like conservatives don't have any ideas on healthcare. I know that's not true because I'm in a think tank, and it's kind of what we do for a living here.
Yep.
But it does seem like conservative politicians oftentimes do not articulate sort of reform ideas of their own. I mean, actually identifying there are poor people in the world. They oftentimes have challenges accessing health care. How do they get affordable health care and be able to take care of themselves and their families? What is a conservative health care reform proposal or idea that you think is a really great idea that might actually do something that doesn't involve state assistance and busted budgets and higher taxes and all the other things that we typically hear from the left?
Well, I think first of all, Matt, we do have to acknowledge that there's a certain population of people in the state that should have Medicaid, that require Medicaid in order to take care of themselves, to take care of their family. Some children, for example, I think need to have access to health care so that they can properly go to school, learn, do all the things that they need to do. So we have to understand, we have to have, first of all, a safety net for those most vulnerable people. Now, the question is how do you define that population? And so, I think about where we are right now at about 250,000. I think we could bring maybe that down just a little bit more, but we have to recognize, first of all, that we have a responsibility to have a safety net. Now, the second part of that question then becomes, then how do you do the other things that you need to do? I think, for example, one of the very first things that we need to do is recognize that we have a cost problem in terms of services that are being provided by hospitals to people on whether or not they have Maine Care, Medicare, private insurance, no insurance. Those costs are way above the rate of inflation that continue to go up, and we need to recognize that we need to have a very serious conversation, a sit down with the hospitals and say, we need to look at controlling costs. And I think we can have that in a very responsible way. But look, I think we need to recognize that people in Maine should expect quality health care. And I think that's where the whole conundrum comes in. How do you have quality health care, trying to control cost, and then different paying systems paying for that? I think all of those things need to come together. I think we need to recognize that the state shouldn't be controlling it. It's not something that the government has a role in terms of dictating to the hospitals, doing A, B, and C. But I think we need to recognize that it's all part of the issue and that we need to sit down and solve it. Do I think that we can solve it? I think the answer is absolutely yes. But again, hospitals need to be part of the solution. Our Medicaid folks have to be part of the solution. Maybe it's talking about managed care in terms of maybe even having someone come in from the private sector. 5% of our people take 55% of the cost in terms of Medicaid. We need to do a better job at managing those costs and those people. But there's a very good way of being able to make progress. But Democrats need to understand that this is a problem in terms of recognizing Maine has to have to be on a sustainable path in terms of expenses and revenues coming into the state. I know that we can get there, Matt.
Let's turn our attention to the issue of education. We've heard an awful lot about a number of different parts of that debate recently. Specifically, I'm thinking of what's going on in Scarborough with the recall of those town councilors related to, in some part, the idea of proficiency-based education. You've got Common Core questions, you've got curriculum questions, there's a lot of other things that circulate around this, but let's start there with the proficiency-based education debate. This is an idea that really has a lot of conservative fingerprints on it, sort of an early days of the LePage administration push, and I guess my question for you is this idea sort of an experiment that went wrong? Did we not define proficiency right? Is it something that should be abandoned? What should we do about how we graduate kids and how we sort of bring them and matriculate them through the school system? And what would you as governor how would you approach the problem?
Well, I think it's a great issue, man. We have to understand that, we're spending $1 billion plus a year on K-12 education in the state of Maine. And I think we need to understand that, number one, that's a lot of money. But look, our most valuable asset here in the state of Maine are our young people. K-12 education, it's a big deal. I'm a first generation college graduate. That meant that I needed to go to school through K through 12 and get the basic things that I needed in order to go to college. Now, I was really fortunate, quite frankly, I think in many ways lived the American dream. I grew up in a little town of Danforth with 600 people. Graduating class had 24 people in it. First in my family to go to college. But not only did I get a public education at the University of Maine Machias, University of Southern Maine, the University of Maine School of Law, I was able to go to Harvard and get a master's degree at the Kennedy School of Government, going to a very small school in remote Maine. And what that means is that any kid, regardless of whether you're going from Danforth, Maine, Van Buren, Maine, or Cape Elizabeth, you're getting the basics in reading, writing, and arithmetic. I think the problem that we're having here in Maine is that we have the federal government, we have the state government telling the local government what they need to do and how they need to do it. I think what we need to do is give local control more responsibility and more leeway in determining what works best in their communities. What works in Cape Elizabeth and Yarmouth probably isn't going to work in Van Buren or Jackman. Let's let those local school boards determine what works best. Proficiency-based education is something that my principal at the high school called me specifically and said, look, we've been doing this now for 3 or 4 or 5 years. We think it's working. We have other schools that are saying, we don't think this is working. Okay, but let's not do yet another, let's be in Augusta, tell you in Danforth, tell you in Jackman what you need to do. Let those local school boards do what they need to do. We need to have a metric and what that means is a measure that we're going to be able to judge on whether or not you're doing your job in terms of graduating kids that meet a certain level of education. But at the end of the day, you know, we can't drive that out of Augusta or Washington, D.C. The answer is local control. Let them have the option, but let's measure what they're doing, and if they're not doing the job, they're going to have to suffer a penalty.
But isn't that part of the problem with proficiency-based education? And I don't mean to sound like a critic of local control because I'm a strong advocate of it, but it seems to me that that was actually one of the flaws in it. They deemed that students needed to have proficiency, and yet what that benchmark of proficiency is seems to have been left up to the individual whims of the school districts, and there doesn't seem to be a clear definition of what those basics are that you're talking about, that sort of standard floor of reading, writing, arithmetic.
Yep.
It doesn't seem like that's well defined. So does that mean that, as an anti-conservative idea, I guess, like that does need to be defined at the state level and then leave the rest to the localities? Or does it mean that we should just repeal the whole idea of proficiency-based education and let the local school boards come up with a curriculum that they think educates their children?
Well, you know, I think the Department of Education has a responsibility to provide some guidelines. Guidelines versus mandates. I guess that's the way that I would suggest that we need to move forward. Because anytime you do a mandate, you know, all kids are different. Kids learn different. Today we have charter schools, we have private schools, we have public schools. You know, we have schools online. So we have to have some guidelines in terms of what we expect. We have homeschooling. We have to have some guidelines in terms of what we expect a child to learn K through 12. And I think we can do testing along the way that measures that. And, you know, right now we do have kids that are testing in the first grade, the fourth grade, seventh grade, 11th grade. So we do have mechanisms, we have metrics in place where we can identify if a particular child, for example, is not meeting a certain level of math or English or whatnot. And then I think we can use part of that to look at the school and say, you need to do a better job than this. Now look, I'm going to use RSU 19 in my hometown as a good example. We are right now in the process of building a new centralized middle school and high school. We're closing down some smaller schools throughout the district. We're going to save some money like that. We're bringing resources all together in one location so that now we essentially have a K through 12 school in Newport that's servicing about 8 towns. And now we have everybody all under one roof. We have principals under one roof, guidance counselors under one roof, teachers under one roof. It should be really easy now to start looking at, as we go out in the out years, bringing all these kids together, are we giving everybody an equal share? Parts of the kids that come into our high school from other parts of the district are performing less well when they're coming into 9th grade than other parts. So let's now bring all those kids together, those parents together, bring all those synergies together with the parents as well, and build a better high school and a better community. I think that we're going to be doing that right in Newport, Maine, and it can be replicated throughout the state.
You know, how we relate to education is also a question of how we pay for it. And of course, we have the now famous 55% funding mechanism where the state is responsible for that portion of the school budget. And it finally met in the last budget deal that was agreed upon. How much should the state be paying for education? And I guess to back it up and make it more of a philosophical question as well, to piggyback on that, what is the role of money in education anyway? I mean, how much does it take to educate a child? It seems like that cost continues to explode every single year, not only at the K-12 level, but also in, obviously, a college environment. So what exactly do you think money's role in this is? Is more money producing better results? And if so, how does that get delivered to the actual classroom rather than some of the bureaucratic red tape and administrative costs that we're seeing?
Well, I mean, I think that's a great answer, Matt, and I think it's answered on a number of levels. Number one, I, for example, would continue to expand the school construction program for schools, first of all, that are closing additional schools, but schools also that are unsafe. Now, the Nokomis Regional High School, in the middle of the winter, it was freezing in there. In the middle of the summer, the heat was turned up, it seemed, to 110 degrees. We had out rooms that weren't properly working, and so we need to look at safety, first of all. We have, number two, I think, ongoing growing concerns about safety of children in regards to the lone wolf shooters out there that are happening in other states. I think we need to harden schools so that we have better safety in the schools. But number two, I think we then have to look at administration. The state of Maine spends way too much money on administration, so that I think we can cut the amount of money where we have superintendents, officers, assistant superintendents. I think that that's an issue. And then we need to look at the classroom in terms of teachers. Now, look, I mean, a lot of these teachers start out make salaries of $30,000 a year. Are we attracting the best people into education when, you know, with a growing minimum wage, before long it's going to be a minimum wage entry-level job to be a teacher. So, I mean, I think that that's a concern. So, again, I don't think we're going to ever be able to meet what might be considered a local cost for education, particularly with special education. Special education, you can have one child that might be costing $100,000 that's driving up that school budget. Now, if you take and you have 10 of those, 20 or 30 of those in your local school district, tied to it with a declining enrollment, that school district is going to be seeing an exploding cost for education. So we have to start looking at, first of all, a school funding formula that's written in English so that we can actually understand it. Nobody understands it. It's a horrible formula. We need to go back and rework that so that it makes sense. We need to look at ability to pay, but we also need to look at rural Maine's ability in terms of having fairness so that a kid in Danforth, Maine, like me growing up, has the exact same opportunity as a kid in Cape Elizabeth. And we need to do that within existing resources.
Well, after students make their way through the Maine K-12 education system, many of them, of course, go on to higher education, seek education at the University of Maine or one of Maine's other higher institutes of higher learning. And, of course, they have to use remedial education a lot of times on English and whatnot, but once they get there, they are saddled with an unbelievable amount of debt and oftentimes are ill-prepared for the economy that they go into after they graduate or, frankly, drop out oftentimes. What is the state of higher education in Maine right now? Is it aligned with the workforce? Is it producing future leaders and workers at a rate that Maine needs? And if it isn't, what do we do about that?
Well, I think, Matt, there's a couple of answers to this question. And the first part that I would answer is our Maine community colleges, who I think are really doing a great job. My understanding is about 2/3 of Maine students, in terms of higher ed, are attending the Maine community colleges, but have less than 1/3 of the budget. And so these are the people that are going, for example, to Kennebec Valley Community College. They're learning to become linemen, or maybe they're going there to become a nurse, or maybe they're going there to become a plumber or an electrician. Those people are coming out into the economy where there's a huge demand right now for their skills. It is certainly above market rate wages in the state of Maine, both rural and in urban Maine. And so I think our community colleges with an annual tuition rate of about $2,500, I think it's a little less, I think they're doing a great job. Now, I think in terms of our universities, I think we do have a little bit more of a challenge there. You know, again, the reason why I think I'm the most qualified candidate to be governor is because I think there are strategic investments at the state level that we need to make in our universities. For example, I made sure that we had a $50 million funding mechanism in this last budget to put a new engineering building at the University of Maine. We have a rising demand for engineers. You have places like Chimbro, Bath Iron Works, Pratt Whitney, that needs engineers, that if we are not producing those engineers, those businesses are going to go other places. I also sponsored a building for a science lab to make sure that we can do more research on agriculture at the University of Maine, and an education building at Maine Maritime Academy, where those kids are going there and are getting fantastic jobs at about 100% placement rates when they graduate. So I think there's a role for strategic investments for higher ed in Maine, but I'm concerned that we have a model right now that's not sustainable. Now, what I mean by that, Matt, is simply this. We have 4 colleges in Maine right now where we're saying if you're Pell eligible, we're essentially going to let you go to college for free. We also have a declining demographic population for young people in Maine, which means we have fewer and fewer students trying to fill the pipeline for these placements in higher ed. I don't think that those are sustainable models. I think they fill a niche right now, but I think higher ed in Maine, the University of Maine system in particular, needs to take a real hard look at what it is in terms of their 5 and 10-year vision is. And I think it's going to be very different a decade from now if it's to survive.
You bring up community colleges as a success story, and they undoubtedly are. There's no question about that at all. And frequently we hear people talk about the need for more trade jobs and more training in a lot of these sort of blue-collar jobs that are currently going unfilled in the Maine economy. Yet, if you look at the people that are going through the community college system, increasingly, I don't have a real solid number here for you, but I've been told that like EMNC has about 70% of people that are getting essentially a liberal arts education at the community college level. So what they're doing is they're going for what would have been a college education at a 4-year university, but doing it cheaper and trying to get some of it knocked out before they go on to perhaps the University of Maine or University of Southern Maine or whatnot. Is that really what the role of the community colleges should be? Or should they be really geared towards training some of these people that are so desperately needed in the Maine economy? And can you really even blame the Maine community college system for going after those people to continue to grow and produce graduates out of their programs?
Well, Matt, I'm going to answer that in a couple of ways. And I can remember, for example, when Jock McKernan was governor of the state of Maine, put a real incentive on aspirations for Maine kids, particularly back in the 1990s. And what I mean by that is in Newport, we have 70% free and reduced lunches of students that come to our schools. Now, oftentimes those people come from very poor backgrounds, very poor communities. Maybe mom or dad never went to college. Oftentimes, a great entry place for those kids is at the community college system. It's more friendly, it's more hands-on, it's more understandable. And if someone's going to sort of begin to want to figure out what it is that they want to do in life, it's much easier for them and their parents to do that at the community college level rather than taking on a $25,000 hit at the University of Maine and say, well, look, I don't want to do this anymore. Now I want to do this, and now maybe they have $50,000 in debt. So I think our community colleges are sort of right fit at the right place. And let's acknowledge another important role that our community colleges do. Because of the failure of some of our K-12 schools, they have to offer a lot of remedial level courses. And so for maybe some of those kids that didn't get what they needed, or maybe they weren't ready at the high school level to do what they needed to do, I'm not in favor of having to do those remedial level courses, but we have to have a place for those students to go. And if they can go to the community colleges and do that, I think that's important. I think this is less about where a kid is going to go to college in terms of the community college or the University of Maine, but recognizing that we have a sort of a one system, a higher ed system in Maine, whether it's Maine Maritime, private schools. My kids both go to school in Bangor at Husson University because of the programs that they offer that some of the public schools don't. So it's not one size fits all, but let's recognize that we have to have the right size system, an affordable system, but yet at the most important part of it, the word that I like to use a lot, Matt, is sustainability. It has to be sustainable not over just a 2-year budget cycle at the state of Maine level, but a sustainable strategic plan 5 and 10 years out.
Now, while we're talking about the issue of higher education, obviously, I brought it up a moment ago, but the cost that it actually is for somebody to go to college these days. I mean, I graduated 15 years ago or so, and it's significantly higher than even when I went, and I can only imagine compared to when you did. The students that are leaving now have so much debt that it is oftentimes strangling them for 2 to 3 decades after they are leaving the college. And you're talking about people in their mid-40s that still have college loans that they're paying off, or even after that, frankly. Governor LePage has proposed what he sees as a solution, or at least a marginal solution, to try to address the question of student debt. Is that plan something that you think is a good idea? If you don't think it's a good idea, though, where do you criticize it? What do you think can be done better? Or, frankly, do you have another idea that you think is even better?
Well, I think that's a great question, Matt, because I think one of the most important things that we need to recognize is that if we're going to keep people in Maine, people that did go to higher ed, again, whether that's a community college or the University of Maine system, student debt is a big deal. And when they graduate, it's a pretty significant part of their budget in terms of moving forward. I just had a daughter graduate from Husson University. She got a 5-year degree in occupational therapy. She has a boyfriend who also graduated from Husson University. He got an MBA in sports management. They both have debt. Now, first and foremost, when I went to college, Matt, here in the state of Maine, I had debt too when I graduated. I saw it as an investment in myself. And if what that meant was, if that was going to allow me to have a certain skill that I could go out and offer to employers, then that was something that I was willing to do. And One of the skills it gave me was the ability to start my own small business, which I've now operated for nearly 25 years. So I don't think that it's a bad thing. Now, Matt, you may recall there was a student loan sort of repayment plan proposed last session, at the end of the session, in terms of a bond. House Republicans, under my leadership, we rejected that proposal and it did not go forward. And it was because there were a number of problems with that particular proposal, Matt. And one of them specifically was addressing one of your earlier questions, which is what kind of degrees are these people getting? If they're getting a degree in, gardening, then maybe we really don't want to do an investment in people getting a degree in gardening. Now, I'm not putting that down, just giving an example. But at the same time, we also, I think, as House Republicans under my leadership said, we want to have a bill and a program that is going to be designed so that the kids themselves still have skin in the game. Which means is that my daughter should not get a clean slate in terms of her student debt once she graduates. And maybe it's what I would favor is a proposal, and we'll have this conversation, I think, in the legislature in the next coming 30 days. I think there should be, for example, an ability to refinance that debt. Now look, my daughter took out some of these loans through Sallie Mae at 13%. Now, you can go buy a car today, Matt, at 0%. You can go buy a John Deere tractor for 84 months and pay 0%. You can go take a mortgage out on a new home and pay 4%. But yet we're asking some of our youngest and our best and our brightest that we're trying to keep in Maine, you go take out a loan through the federal government, essentially, through Sallie Mae, and pay 13% on that for sometimes 10 or 20 years. I think it's a very easy fix, Matt, to say, look, let's do a 50-year bond, for example, give that money to the Finance Authority of Maine, have some guidelines and some parameters on there that say we can ratchet down that interest rate from 13% maybe to 3 or 4%, so that instead of a kid paying a $900 a month payment, maybe it's $600, maybe it's $500. That's a pretty easy fix. We need to recognize it as a priority with proper guidepost on it. I will support it. House Republicans will support it. And I think we can get that done in June of this year, send it out to the voters and see if they'll support it.
Well, we've been talking for close to an hour now, so before we wrap up, I have a couple more questions in a couple more areas, and then I'll ask you to sort of wrap up your final thoughts here before we let you go. But first, on the to-do list for me is to sort of deal with this question of the referendum and the initiative process. I know that we talk about it a lot, and conservative voters are particularly animated about it. And the reason why, of course, is that it seems to be used by the other side. It seems to be used by the left with great frequency and not so much on the other side of the aisle. Do you view the process as broken? Is this something that is just simply being used better by one ideological side of the aisle? And should conservatives get engaged in that process and attempt to use it and pass tax cuts and pass government reform and welfare reform and all those things? Or is it fundamentally broken and does it require reform? And if the answer is the second one, what do you do?
Well, I think we all recognize there needs to be some reforms done in the process. And I think, for example, a very simple fix would be a requirement to have a certain amount of signatures or certain percentages of signatures for an initiative process to be collected in each county. So that means that people in Cumberland County and Portland would have a sort of a proportional requirement in terms of collecting signatures, as well as Washington County, Aroostook County, and Piscataquis counties. So I think that's an important part. But look, that doesn't happen without leadership, Matt. Again, in terms of the governor working with the legislature, that requires someone sitting down and saying, this is a priority. We need to fix this. Unless we fix it, we aren't going to continue to move forward this way. It's not going to change. That's why I think I'm the best qualified person to be governor, because I understand the process, how it's been abused. But Matt, let's not forget, back in 2010, Republicans successfully used the referendum process to stop a vast expansion of taxes in the state of Maine by defeating a legislative proposal to vastly expand taxes here in the state of Maine. So Republicans used it then, and they were successful in doing something in terms of stopping that. Now, I'm going to also point out, Matt, that the Maine Republican Party recently failed in terms of the governor and the chairman of the party at the time had started a process of trying to go out and collect signatures on an initiative to deal with the tax issue. And look, let's just be honest about it, Matt. They failed in being able to collect enough signatures. Now, shame on us for allowing that to happen, because I think we could have and should have done that. But I think the process, which is part of our state constitution, if it's going to be changed, has to be changed by Maine voters, by efforts led at the legislative level with the governor and the legislature. It can and should be done, but we should not do away with the process in its entirety, because I believe that our forefathers said, look, ultimately the power should be vested in the people and let the people decide. But I think we need to reform it, and then it should have the ability to go forward, I think, in a way that's going to be far more judiciously used.
I also want to tackle briefly the topic of energy. It's not something that's a super sexy topic, but obviously it does affect not only consumers of energy, but also businesses. I mean, the amount of money that a business has to lay down to pay for their energy costs is significant. And you frequently hear that Maine is the best in New England, but as you know, when you compare it to other areas of the country, we are significantly higher than them, and it puts us at a competitive disadvantage when you're trying to recruit a business here, especially one that's going to be a high consumer of energy. What can be done in Maine to try to bring the cost of electricity down? How do we actually reform that system so that it makes sense and it actually provides this cheaper electricity to Maine consumers and businesses?
Well, Matt, let's be very clear. There is no other Republican candidate, no other Republican nominee that has the background and the success of the work that I've done in energy in the state of Maine. What I mean by that is twofold. First of all, I worked with the chairman, both Democrats, by the way, Senate and House, Democrats of the Legislative Energy Committee, to pass the Omnibus Energy Bill, which was an important bill that was in fact signed by the governor and became law, even though he had previously indicated he may veto it. And that bill essentially did something, Matt, that I think is fairly significant. What it said is that we as a country have lots of natural gas, but it's down in Pennsylvania. And we need to get that through a pipeline to come into Massachusetts. It's where most of the electricity is generated. And we passed a bill called the Omnibus Energy Bill that said, let's grow the pipeline. Now, what that meant was, you have a pipeline, it's a certain size. What we said is, let's make it just a little bit bigger so we can get more cheap natural gas in the pipeline coming into New England to drive down the price of electricity. That was a bill that passed, something that we did with the Democrats. It's continuing to use it. I read an article today, for example, where Paul LePage, our governor, is down in Massachusetts talking to PUC members from throughout New England, talking about expanding capacity for natural gas to come into New England. That's something that I worked on, worked with Democrats, worked with the governor. It's still a work in progress, but we have to recognize that there are fossil fuel energy sources going offline, even as we speak. Coal, nuclear power, the nuclear power plants being shut down. If we do not replace those, something's going to happen. So I've already done that, number one. Number two, Matt, I'm the only Republican nominee that has gone forward, a Republican candidate, that has visited Quebec, where we are in conversations with right now in terms of building essentially a corridor to transmit Hydro-Quebec power from Quebec down again into Boston, which is where most of this power has to get generated, because power in Massachusetts affects rates in Maine. That has done that. I've been to Labrador, visited the dams there specifically. I'm the only candidate that has done that. Last year I traveled to St. James Bay, where we visited with Quebec officials, and again visited some of the dams up there that are generating and using the same drop of electricity, one drop of water coming down through 8 dams. Every one of those dams going through a turbine and creating non-carbon polluting electricity. Now that's not rocket science. It's something that we've been doing for a long time. But I've been doing that in my role. I've been doing it as the chairman of the Maine Canadian Legislative Advisory Commission in my interest as energy in Maine. And so I think I have a great foundation to recognize that we have to have a regional approach to this, but something that also has to be in Maine's ratepayers' best interest.
All right, and finally, Ken, before we let you go, I have a pretty simple question that I don't think should be very difficult for you to answer, but is a pretty good one. We've talked about a lot of issues here. Obviously, we keep going for probably hours on a number of other ones. But when people run for governor, there are certainly a variety of motivations that went into them running in the first place, and certain things that they really want to accomplish if they become governor. With what we've talked about so far, and maybe some of the things that we haven't gotten to yet, what is the, I think, defining issue and the defining motivating factor for you running for governor? What is it that you want to be remembered for after being elected and becoming Governor Fredette? What is the issue that people will look back on your time in office as having been a hallmark of who you are and what kind of governor you were?
Well, Matt, look, I think the biggest asset that the state of Maine has is its people. And our second biggest asset is its natural resources. And what that means is that Maine has probably got the best quality of life, I think, in the country in terms of a place to work and raise a family. So I think the work that I've done over the last 10 years in the legislature, I think what's really driven me to work so hard with the governor, work with House Republicans to do the things that we've done over the last 8 years, has really driven me to make the decision to run for governor. Now, what I mean by that is because I believe I am the most qualified because of a lot of that work. I think a lot of it is still left undone. And what I mean by that is that I think in terms of having a quality of place to work, you have to also have quality jobs. So that if someone's going to decide to live in Newport, Maine, or Presque Isle, Maine, or in Washington County, Maine, you shouldn't have to make great sacrifices to live in rural Maine, or even in Portland, or even in York County. So what that means is bringing together a tax structure, bringing together our infrastructure, bringing together our resources that we have, bringing together what I think is an asset in terms of our elderly population, our senior population in Maine, bringing all those things together so that we have a great state where you can live and work, raise a family, enjoy a concert in Bangor and Portland on a Saturday night, but also in the morning look forward to getting up and going to a great job that you enjoy. Having an affordable education, if you decide to go to college, if you go to the trade school. Have it so that if you're going to go to a K-12 school, whether it be in Danforth, Maine, or in Cape Elizabeth, Maine, you're going to get that same opportunity to get a decent education, a quality education, so that if you decide to go to a trade school or go to Harvard like I did, that you can do that right here in Maine. And it shouldn't matter if you're doing that in Danforth, Maine, or in Yarmouth, Maine. I think all those things are important. I want people to look back and say, those were a great 8 years for Maine because we changed, we reformed Maine. We cannot stay the same. We cannot continue the status quo, but that we were changing Maine. We were forming welfare, giving people opportunities, and we saw Maine's population grow, and it was a great place to live.
All right, well, Ken Fredette, candidate for governor, running as a Republican. We really appreciate you coming into the Lion's Den here and sitting down and talking about policy with us. Obviously, the election's in a few weeks, so we'll see how it all turns out, but it's always good to sit down and actually get the kind of unfiltered, untimed answers to a lot of these questions because, of course, so many people running for governor are so truncated in their answers all the time when you see these debates that you don't really get a good sense of who they are. So we hope that this has helped illuminate that for a little bit for the people who are at home watching this, for people who are interested in Ken, and for people who are interested in the other candidates. Thank you so much again for watching, and we'll continue on with more candidates coming up very soon.